We're going to see how the Chaos Dwarf units stack up against some of the best that Total War Warhammer 3 has to offer. Will any of these Chaos Dwarf units be able to dethrone some of the champions of various categories? Let's find out. We'll kick it off with the Infernal Guard with great weapons, an armor-piercing anti-infantry unit. Can they beat the Exalted Bloodletters, the current champion that beats up all the other infantry, the non-raw stuff anyway? Now these Infernal Guard are a little bit of a hybrid unit. They're kind of a damage dealer with their armor-piercing damage, but they also have quite a bit of melee defense, so they're kind of defensive as well. Now one advantage they do have in this fight is the Bloodletters cause fire damage, and the Infernal Guard, if I can get to their goddamn unit card, they have a fire resistance of 25%. So they're going to reduce the Bloodletter attack by 25%, although it doesn't seem to be helping them too much so far. They're putting up some good damage on the Bloodletters, but they are ultimately losing. The Bloodletter damage output just too much for them, it seems. And that is the story of this fight. Unfortunately for the Infernal Guard, not able to top the Bloodletters. But hey, it was a tall order. So they can't be number one, but maybe they could be number two. Let's try them out against the Sword Masters of Hoeth, the Hoe Masters, if you will. And the Hoe Masters in Warhammer 3 kind of got a bit juiced up as their martial prowess now lasts longer than it did in Warhammer 2, so they became pretty powerful, these Hoe Masters. And it looks like they've still got it as they're putting these Infernal Guard quite quickly in the bin. They've got them down below half health already. And you might notice the Infernal Guard have a charge defense, but it's only against large, so no point standing them still here. They do considerably worse if you don't charge them. But I think what's happening here is the higher melee defense isn't really saving these Infernal Guard from the higher melee attack of these other units they're facing, because the Infernal Guard melee attack is actually quite low. It's like 32, which for this kind of unit is quite low comparatively. The Hoe Masters have like 50 something. So maybe not quite up to task in this situation, although the two units they have fought are more expensive than them. So let's try something that's the same price as them. Black Orcs. Both of these units cost 1150, so let's see if the Infernal Guard Great Weapons are maybe a little underpowered for their class of elite anti-infantry, or whether they stack up the same or maybe better than Black Orcs. Honestly, you'd expect them to be the same because they have kind of the same role and the same pricing. You expect similar performance in the same situation. So against each other, it should be a pretty close, pretty even fight. Could go either way. That's how I predict this fight should go. So far, kind of looking like that. It's pretty even damage amounts done to each other. And the Black Orcs also don't have the highest amount of melee attack at 36, but they do have a considerably better charge bonus. So that helps them drop some damage nice and early on. But as we can see, all these fights still looking very, very close. So who's gonna do it? Well, jumping forward a little bit, we can see it's a pretty bloody affair, and it's a pretty close one overall. Some Black Orcs going to break here, but down the other end we see two units of Infernal Guard have broken, and the other two remaining fights are very, very close, as expected, so this could go either way. But ultimately, I think you can say these two pretty much the same performance. So the Infernal Guard with great weapons, much like the Black Orcs, are pretty good, great anti-infantry, but not quite the best. How about the Infernal Iron Sworn then? They are a different kind of unit, though more of a holding unit, not a damage dealer. They don't have armor piercing, but how do they stack up against their counterpart, the Dwarf Iron Breakers? Now, it's worth noting that I decided not to use the blasting charges in this fight because I couldn't really get an even exchange of letting them both use their blasting charges. The Iron Sworn have a little more range, so they get to use theirs sooner, and then all the dwarfs get knocked over, and it's just not really fair. And in a real-world situation, that's absolutely fine, but we just want to find out who's the tankiest here, who's the most sturdy. Because they're basically the same unit, but which one's the best? Now, if you do let them use the blasting charges, the Iron Sworn blasting charge is armor piercing, whereas the Iron Breaker's blasting charge isn't, so that's a pretty huge advantage straight off the bat. So for the most part, Iron Sworn are probably going to win because they can use their blasting charge first in a real world situation. But if you do let them go toe-to-toe, pure melee only, well, you better be in it for the long haul, because it's going to take a while. Good God, man. This is worse than when Treekin fought Ironbreakers. This is quite possibly taking the title for the longest possible fight between two units in Total War Warhammer 3. This fight taking literally about 10 minutes to get done. And as you may notice, the Iron Sworn have pulled ahead in these fights, and they are going to be able to beat the Ironbreakers fairly comfortably with a little bit of health left to still do some other work. So safe to say the Infernal Ironsworn are better than Iron Breakers, especially if they get to use that blasting charge, which not only has a little bit more range, but also is armor piercing, so they're definitely going to win if they use that. But overall, we have a new tankiest unit in town, and it is the Infernal Ironsworn. Now let's move on to the real fight that I know you came to see. The other end of the spectrum are the Goblin Laborers, the new worst infantry in the game. Can they take the title from the peasant mob? Stats-wise, they're both similarly shit. So it's anybody's guess who's going to be the crappiest. And in come their absolutely pathetic charges into each other. The peasant mob with the advantage there, though, with their 8 charge bonus to the 6 of the goblins. That could make all the difference. Look at this nutter just charging in. Oh, he's paid the price. The price was his head. Down he goes. A slight advantage to the peasant mob. They have a little bit of armor to the 0 of the gobbos. Slight advantage in melee attack to the peasants, but advantage in weapon strength to the gobbos. So it's anybody's guess here. It's looking pretty even so far. Slight advantage to the gobbos in unit size as well. They have a little bit of a bigger unit size at 180 to the 160 of the peasants. What an absolutely thrilling slobber knocker this is. I bet you're glad you clicked on this video now, huh? Absolute premium content. But it looks like the peasant mob are trying to retain their title. They are slowly starting to lose. Will the gobbos have it in them to not be right at the bottom? It looks like they will. There's some wavering from the peasant mob. And what an absolutely fantastic performance they've put up here. Looking like they're going to maintain their title. The poor gobbos, they're just too good. They're too good to get the worst title. Oh, look at the peasant mob. Look at them all wavering. They know how to make a pathetic exit. Well played. So can confirm peasant mob still the worst unit in the game. Now back to the other end of the spectrum, one of the best units in the roster, the Immortals, the Regiment of Renown Infernal Ironsworn. They got fire and magic damage bonus versus infantry, undying will, so they won't die for the first 25% of their health, but they do lack armor-piercing damage. Now, can they topple the strongest infantry in the game, the Hell-Forged Host, the Regiment of Renown Exalted Bloodletters? They're both coming in hot, pun intended, doing some strong damage on the charge for both sides. But a few advantages for the Immortals. They're going to take 25% less damage because of their fire resistance. They also have magical attacks to negate the physical resistance of the Bloodletters. Also, the Bloodletters don't have a ton of armor, so the lack of armor piercing doesn't really matter too much for the Immortals. And this one is moving quick. The Bloodletters are going down, it seems. They're down to a quarter of their health left, while the Immortals still at half. And it looks like we are going to have a new champion in the elite anti-infantry department. So, hot damn, who knew? These two units cost the same as well, so it's a fair fight from that perspective. But I think the Immortals just had all the right tools here to be able to take the Bloodletters down. So I asked myself, well, are they really good? Are they really the best unit? Or is it just they had all the right things going for them in this fight? Well, there's only one way to find out, right? Let's see who else they can take down. We're going to try the Hoemasters first of all, who a lot of the Immortals' advantages won't be any use against. Their fire resistance, useless here. Their magical attack, this poor fella. Imagine getting knocked out straight away on contact, being the first guy down. Nobody wants to be that guy. Anyway, what was I on about? Yeah, their magical attacks, no use here. Fire resistance, no use here. Their lack of armor piercing might hurt them a little more here because they do have more armor. The Hoemasters, 90 compared to the Bloodletters, 60. But it looks like they might be putting the Hoemasters away pretty well anyway. And one thing it doesn't actually mention on the unit card of this unit is that they do seem to have Death Blow. You know the Slayers, when they die, they do a little two-handed axe attack as they die? The Immortals do that. So they have that kind of extra attack that they're always going to have when any one of them dies. And that is going to allow them to do a fair bit of extra damage. So able to beat the Hoemasters here, looking like the Immortals might be able to beat even the heavily armored units. But of course the Immortals are a little bit more expensive than the Hoemasters. They are a Regiment of Renown as well, which generally gives them some advantages. But there is one unit that is more expensive than the Immortals at 1550, the Chosen of Nurgle. Let's see if they've got what it takes to take down the Immortals. Pretty much the same cost here, so it's going to be a close one, I reckon. Fairly similar damage coming off the charge, no one really taking the lead yet. The Immortals do have the advantage that their units won't die though for the first 25% of their health, so that can leave them with a numbers advantage in the long run. Another thing about the Immortals as well is that they do have really high leadership at 95, so that's pretty huge and certainly is going to help them in this kind of testing, but still pretty even in the damage output so far. The Chosen do have 120 armor, and as the Immortals don't have that armor piercing, this might be the kind of area where it's going to be a bit more of a problem for them. And as this fight wears on, it still stays pretty close, with some fights leaning towards a certain side, but it's a little bit of both. Some fights the Chosen are winning, some fights the Immortals are winning. It's anybody's guess. And I'll cut to the chase because it is a bit of a slow one to finish this, but as predicted, their price being roughly the same, their performance is pretty much the same as well. But overall from this, we at least found a unit that can beat the Hellforged host, who could beat every other unit before. Well, now they do have one they lose to. So GG Immortals. Now onto a cavalry type unit in the Bull Centaur renders with great weapons. As an anti-large unit, their target is of course other large things. Monsters and cavalry. In this case, we're going to try them against other cavalry, starting off with the Skull Crushers, who are also anti-large and armor piercing, so same role, and they have taken an absolute hammering on the charge. They're down to half health already. Lord Jesus, what is happening? This is actually quite alarming because the Bull Centaur great weapons cost 1450 and the Skull Crushers 1700. Now for two units in the same kind of bracket and role and type, shall we say, price usually dictates performance. You'll see like a hierarchy with the more expensive units being better, but here we see the considerably cheaper unit, 250 cheaper, putting up a better performance than the more expensive one. Now, price isn't everything, absolutely. Sometimes there's some anomalies where a unit will just have the right traits to beat a certain enemy, like we kind of saw with the Immortals and Hellforged host. So I decided to try the Bull Centaur great weapons against some other, even more expensive, even stronger anti-large armor-piercing cavalries. How about the Royal Altdorf Gryphites? Another one of the strongest units in this role. 1850 they cost, 400 more than the Bull Centaur great weapons. They are anti-large, they're armor-piercing as well. They should be able to take these down, no problem. We'll see what they can do. Now, you could make the point that the Bull Centaurs are more on the monstrous side, but the Gryphites are also a monstrous cavalry, as were the Skull Crushers just now. But we can see the Gryphites struggling here too. The Bull Centaurs with the great weapons looking like they're going to be able to beat these much more expensive Royal Altdorf Gryphites, so oh scheisse. At this point, the Bull Centaur renders are looking like they're either too strong or not expensive enough. And how about one last test then to really nail it down and figure it out? Well, there can be only one test. It's the Summoners of Rage, the best anti-large unit in the kind of cavalry / monster type department. Anti-large, armor-piercing, just like all these other units. And they cost a big old 2,000, although they do have a bound spell, which you're not really going to use here, so think of them maybe as more like 1900. But still, they should be able to beat a 1450 cost unit, even if it is the same type. They have much better stats overall, so this shouldn't be a problem for them, but it's looking like it's gonna be. It's kind of even in some of these fights. The Bull Centaurs are putting up a goddamn good fight, knocking down a lot of these Dragon Ogres. They're winning this fight here by the looks of it. They've got more health left anyway. I think what's allowing them to be so strong is that they've got a big charge bonus and big weapon strength, more so than the Summoners of Rage in this case. And overall, this contest is going to be a pretty even one. Some of the Bull Centaurs losing, some of the Summoners losing. So they're kind of on an even playing field, these two units, which, as I say in my book, if a unit costs 1450 and it's hanging in there with a unit that costs 2000, something is off. I think the Bull Centaurs are either a little bit too strong or a little bit underpriced, or quite underpriced, and I think it's the latter. They need to be much more expensive. They've got similar stats to the Summoners of Rage. They've got big weapon strength like the Summoners of Rage, whereas the weapon strength of the Skull Crushers and Gryphites is only like 50-60 compared to the 100-110 of these two units. So yeah, Bull Centaurs with great weapons, overpowered at the moment in my opinion. Don't be surprised if they get much more expensive before release though, or if maybe they catch a nerf before you get your hands on them. Pretty beefy right now though. Speaking of beefy, how about the biggest boy, the Kadai Destroyer? How does it stack up against other top monsters? Now, to be fair to the Destroyer, this is not its fight. It's more of an anti-infantry monster, doesn't have a bonus versus large, does have huge weapon strength and armor piercing, but you'll notice by some of its attack animations that it's supposed to be blowing up crowds and stuff. It fires like 3 fireballs out at one point, and they just kind of like grenade fall onto the ground and explode. That's obviously kind of useless against a single entity like this. There it is, you saw it there. So do bear that in mind for these fights. This is not the Destroyer's domain really, but how well will it do against those other single entities that you will likely come across during battles? Well, so far against the Terracotta Sentinel here, it's doing okay. These two cost roughly the same, and we have seen before that the Terracotta Sentinel is able to beat up all the other monsters in this game, even the anti-large ones, whereas himself is not anti-large. But this fight's going to go on for a good old while, and the Terracotta Sentinel has the one big advantage in these kind of fights, that it is unbreakable, whereas all these other monsters are not. So unfortunately for the old Destroyers, they are not going to be able to beat the Terracotta Sentinel, although it's very, very close in some situations. A couple of these Sentinels going down to 400 health, but they're not quite able to finish any of them off. Here's the dying animation of the Destroyer, which is pretty cool as well, as the soul leaves its body. There he goes. He's just an empty husk now. Pretty cool. I also tested the Destroyer against the good old Bloodthirster, who is an anti-large beast. Going to allow him to have his flying attack coming in as he would, so no charge bonus for the old Destroyer, but will it make a difference? We shall see. Both very strong monster killing units, a few sort of synced animations going on, which is always nice. Bloodthirster taking a bit of big damage early. There is the Blazing Body ability that the Destroyer has, which means these things will take damage being nearby, but it's not a lot, I guess, to something like a Bloodthirster, but the damage is going on the Bloodthirster pretty quick, and the Destroyer has the advantage of a fire resistance. They both have physical resistances, and they both have magical attacks though, so they're both negating that on each other, but still an advantage to the Destroyer with that fire resistance. And ultimately, the Destroyer is able to put the Bloodthirster away, which is pretty good. It does cost a little more than the Bloodthirster, but the Bloodthirster is anti-large and is supposed to take down large things. But I think it's that 25% fire resistance really helping the Destroyer there, and it does absolutely destroy the Bloodthirster in this case. Plus, it does have just absolutely massive weapon strength at 680, which is more, considerably more actually, than the Bloodthirster, so a fair destroying from the Destroyer here. And I did test it against a couple of other monsters, but it's pretty much like watching the same fight, and it did win some, lose some, so it's pretty good at taking on other monsters, but not the best. And as I say, it's more of an anti-infantry monster overall, I think. Now, with the Dreadquake Mortar on the scene, it's a very similar thing to old Queen Bess here. Let's see which one is better at killing stuff, and what better way to test this than by killing elves, one of my favourite pastimes. Let's see how much damage Queen Bess does on her initial shot on some Phoenix Guard. The first missiles are coming down, gonna land pretty damn well, and it does about a third of the health of the Phoenix Guard. And that seems pretty consistent across all these units, the ones that hit well anyway. Seems to be about a third of the health gone. Pretty nice, pretty strong, good old Queen Bess. Now the other way we're going to measure this is just to see how many shots it takes to rout off all of these elf units. Because of course there's always the chance of missing and stuff like that, so it might not always be as quick as you might think. A fairly good shot there. But I'm going to save us some time and skip to the end point here. It takes 8 shots from Queen Bess to get rid of all of these high elf units. One of them routed sooner, maybe around 5 or 6, but ultimately let's say it's 8 shots to rout off all these units of high elf Phoenix Guard. Now we're going to do the same thing with the Dreadquake Mortar. We'll see what its initial damage is on its first shot, and then how many shots it takes to completely rout off all of those units. So bombs away, first shots are off. Let's see what the initial damage is. It does do like an after effect damage on this as well. As you'll see in a second, huge explosion. And then you see this kind of quaking going on. That's doing damage to these units as well. And you can see they've taken about a third of their health, and then they're taking even more, taking the Phoenix Guard down to half health pretty much from the first shot alone. So that shot landed pretty well, but they haven't all done that. Some of these are only like a quarter, maybe a third health off. So it's like the damage is somewhere between a half and a third. Let's see how that second shot does. Of course, if a unit is moving, they're going to move out of range of that quake effect, so that won't do so much damage there. So potential for this not to do as much damage as it is here. But it's got these Phoenix Guard pretty beaten up already. How many shots does it take though? 8 from Queen Bess. How many for the Dreadquake Mortar? Well, this is the 6th shot coming in, and this is going to be the one to end it, although one of the units did break after 3 shots. So I think it's fair to say that the Dreadquake Mortar is stronger than Queen Bess, although it seemed less accurate. A lot of the shots were missing, and as I say, you could just run away from that mortar effect, so it's probably still a fairly even playing field, but in just a straight-up test like this, the Dreadquake Mortar seems to be capable of more damage in a single shot if it lands well. But there we go, some of the Chaos Dwarf units tested against the best that Warhammer 3 has to offer. These are going to mix up the game a little bit with some strong units being added in. Excited to see how those go overall. Hope you've enjoyed this, thanks for watching, thanks to all the patrons who support this here channel. If you want to get involved, you can join the secret Discord, get some giveaways, it's all good. Hope you've enjoyed this, thanks for watching, I will see you in the future.